The neon sign of the rusty hub flickered against the heavy rain, casting a jagged, blood-red glow over the asphalt. I'd pulled in for a quick bite, but the moment I stepped inside, the air turned cold. A young waitress, her hands shaking so hard the coffee sloshed over the rim of the cup, stared at the ink on my forearm, an old unit crest from a life I left behind. She didn't just refuse to serve me, she looked at me like I was a ghost coming to claim a debt. 10 minutes later, I was back in the cab of my Peterbilt when the diner's back door flew open and she came sprinting toward the truck, her face a mask of pure terror with 3 sets of headlights tearing out of the darkness behind her. I didn't need to see the knives or the iron pipes to know that my quiet night was over. Before we continue, let us know where you're tuning in from. Drop your city and mile marker in the comments. You're watching Highway Stories Untold, and we love seeing how far these stories travel. The rain was coming down in sheets, the kind of heavy, rhythmic drumming on the roof of the cab that usually puts a man in a trance. I had my elbow on the door rest, watching the wipers struggle against the deluge. I was hauling a load of dry goods down to Memphis, and the rusty hub was the only light for 20 miles. It was one of those places that smelled like old grease and desperation, tucked away where the highway starts to feel like a graveyard for missed exits. Beside me, Bear shifted his weight. The big German shepherd didn't like the atmosphere any more than I did. He let out a low, vibrating huff, his ears twitching toward the diner. "Just a coffee, Bear, then we're back on the blacktop," I muttered, more to myself than him. I climbed out, the cold rain soaking through my flannel shirt instantly. I rolled up my sleeves as I walked, a habit from the heat of the cab. The bell above the door chimed a lonely, high-pitched note. The diner was nearly empty. A couple of truckers sat at the far end, hunched over their plates, and a group of guys in leather jackets occupied a booth near the kitchen, their voices low and jagged. The waitress was behind the counter, wiping down a spot that was already clean. She looked young, maybe early 20s, but her eyes had that tired, 1,000-yard stare you usually only see in combat zones. I took a stool at the counter. "Evening. Just a black coffee and whatever's easiest on the grill," I said, keeping my voice low and level. She looked up, and for a split second there was a spark of something human in her eyes. But then her gaze dropped to my right forearm. "I have a tattoo there. The 10th Mountain Division crest, crossed with a piece of wire and a date that still burns in my memory." Her face went pale, a sickly shade of grey. The rag fell from her hand. I can't serve you," she whispered. Her voice was thin, like a wire about to snap. I frowned, keeping my hands visible on the laminate. "Is there a problem? I'm just passing through." "Please," she said, her eyes darting toward the booth of men in the corner. "You have to leave. That mark." "They'll see it. They're already looking." I didn't turn around. I didn't have to. I could feel the temperature in the room drop. The low murmur from the booth had stopped. One of them, a man with a jagged scar running from his ear to his jawline, stood up. He was big, built like a brick wall, and he carried himself with the kind of entitlement that only comes from being the biggest predator in a small pond. "She said we're closed to your kind, old man," the guy said. He walked over, his boots heavy on the linoleum. He didn't look at me, he looked at the girl. "Isn't that right, Sarah? We told you about outsiders." Sarah looked like she wanted to disappear into the floorboards. She was trembling so violently now that the spoons in the canister next to her started to rattle. "He's just leaving, Miller. He was just leaving." I stood up slowly. I'm not a man who looks for trouble, but I've spent enough time in the dirt to know when a predator is cornering a lamb. I caught Miller's eyes, flat, mean, and empty. He wanted a reaction. He wanted to see me scramble. "Coffee's probably burnt anyway," I said, my voice like gravel. I pulled a $5 bill from my pocket and laid it flat on the counter. "Keep it, Sarah, for the trouble." As I turned to walk out, Miller stepped into my path. He was a head shorter than me, but wider. He smelled like cheap bourbon and stale cigarettes. He reached out to grab my arm, right where the tattoo was. I didn't think. I moved. It was a fluid, practiced motion. I caught his wrist before he could make contact, my thumb pressing into the soft tissue between his radius and ulna. I didn't squeeze hard, just enough to let him know the door was locked. "Don't," I said. He sneered, but I saw the flicker of surprise in his eyes. He hadn't expected the old trucker to have hands that fast. He pulled back and I let him go, walking out into the rain without looking back. I climbed back into the Peterbilt, my heart thumping a steady, heavy rhythm against my ribs. Bear was standing on the passenger seat, his hackles raised, a low growl rolling in his chest. He'd seen the whole thing through the windshield. "Steady, boy," I whispered, reaching over to scratch behind his ears. "We're going." I started the engine, the big diesel purring to life, a comforting rumble that usually settled my nerves. I checked my mirrors, ready to pull out, but something stopped me. In the side mirror, I saw the back door of the diner fly open. Sarah came bursting out into the rain. She wasn't wearing a coat. She was running, her feet slipping on the wet pavement, heading straight for my truck. Behind her, the kitchen door slammed open again, and Miller and his 3 friends came charging out. One of them was swinging a heavy tire iron. Sarah reached the passenger side and began pounding on the door. "Please, open the door. They're going to kill me." I didn't hesitate. I reached across and threw the door open. Bear stepped back just enough to let her scramble inside. She collapsed into the footwell, sobbing, her breath coming in ragged gasps. "Down! Stay down!" I yelled. I slammed the truck into gear, but Miller was already there. He swung the tire iron, shattering the passenger side window. Glass sprayed across the cab like diamonds. Bear let out a roar, not a bark, but a true predatory roar, and lunged toward the broken window, his teeth snapping inches from Miller's face. Miller flinched back, giving me the second I needed. I floored it. The tires spun for a heartbeat, searching for grip on the slick asphalt, then caught. The Peterbilt surged forward, heavy and unstoppable. In the rear view, I saw Miller and his crew scrambling for their vehicles, 2 blacked-out SUVs and a beat-up pickup. "Why are they after you?" I shouted over the wind, whistling through the broken window. Sarah was curled in a ball, her hands over her head. "I saw them," she choked out. "The tattoo. My brother had the same one. He was a cop. They killed him 2 weeks ago because he found their stash. They thought I didn't know, but I found his notes. They're not just bikers, Jack. They're the ones running the whole county." I looked at the road ahead. The highway was a dark ribbon cutting through the pines, and behind us, 3 sets of high beams were gaining fast. They weren't just angry diners anymore. They were hunters, and I had just become their primary target. The high beams hit my side mirror like twin spotlights, blinding me for a split second. I squinted, adjusting the mirror to deflect the glare, but the light seemed to bleed through the very metal of the cab. Sarah was shivering next to me, her breath fogging up the remaining glass in short, panicked bursts. Bear was pacing the narrow sleeper berth behind us, his claws clicking on the floor mat, a rhythmic, restless sound that told me he was ready to move. A low, continuous rumble was vibrating through his chest, a warning he only gave when he sensed something truly foul. He knew we were being hunted. "Stay low, Sarah. Don't let them see your silhouette," I commanded. My voice was flat, carrying that artificial calm that comes right before an engine redlines. I didn't have the luxury of fear. I had 40 tons of momentum and a girl's life in my right hand. Behind us, the first SUV, a heavy-duty Suburban with a custom steel brush guard, lunged forward. They weren't trying to pull me over or engage in some roadside negotiation. They were trying to pit me. On a rain-slicked highway with a full load of dry goods, a pit maneuver isn't an arrest tactic, it's a death sentence. The Suburban's bumper clipped the rear passenger side of my trailer. The jolt shuddered through the entire chassis, vibrating up the steering column and vibrating my teeth. "They're hitting us! They're actually hitting us!" Sarah screamed, clutching the dash until her knuckles turned white. "I felt it," I said, my grip tightening on the wheel. I wasn't going to play their game. I reached down and flipped the toggle for my auxiliary work lights. High-intensity LEDs mounted on the back of the cab, usually meant for backing into pitch-black loading docks in the dead of winter. I waited, watching the Suburban in my mirror as it surged forward for another strike. I timed his approach with the rhythm of the rain on my windshield. Just as he pulled within inches of my dot bumper, I flipped the switch. 6,000 lumens of pure, blinding white light exploded directly into the Suburban driver's retinas. In the darkness of the storm, it must have felt like a flashbang going off in his lap. I saw the vehicle swerve violently. The tires screeched, fighting for grip on the wet asphalt as the driver panicked, overcorrecting in a desperate attempt to find the road he could no longer see. The Suburban fishtailed, its back end swinging out like a pendulum, narrowly missing a concrete bridge abutment before it slid sideways into the muddy median, burying itself up to the axles. One down, but the pickup and the second SUV were smarter. They backed off just enough to stay out of the direct path of the work lights, flanking me on both sides like wolves circling a wounded elk. The pickup, driven by Miller, pulled up alongside the driver's side. He was close, so close I could see the rain beaded on his hood. The passenger window of the pickup rolled down, and I saw the dull, oily glint of a barrel. Crack! The side view mirror shattered, spraying glass across my lap. A second shot punched a jagged hole through the door metal, the lead whistling inches from my hip before embedding itself in the back of my seat. "Bear, get back!" I yelled. The dog didn't need a second order. He retreated further into the sleeper, but he didn't hide. He stood his ground, his eyes fixed on the broken passenger window, where the wind was now howling into the cab, bringing the scent of ozone and wet pavement with it. I couldn't outrun them in a straight line, not with a 500-horsepower diesel fighting against the wind and a heavy load. I needed a bottleneck, a place where their numbers and agility wouldn't mean a damn thing. About 3 miles ahead, I remembered a construction zone I'd passed on the way up. The state was resurfacing a bridge, and they'd choked the 3 lanes down into one narrow corridor flanked by heavy Jersey barriers. If I could get there first, I could dictate the terms of the fight. I slammed the shifter, double-clutching with a precision that was pure muscle memory, finding a higher gear. The turbocharger screamed as it sucked in the cold, wet air, the needle on the manifold pressure gauge climbing into the red. The Peterbilt groaned, the frame twisting under the torque, but she gave me everything she had. Miller's pickup tried to pull ahead to block my path, to force me toward the shoulder, but I didn't give him the inch he wanted. I nudged the steering wheel just a fraction to the left. The heavy steel rim of my front wheel ground against his door panels. The sound was horrific, a high-pitched screech of tearing metal and the staccato pop of trim clips snapping. A shower of sparks lit up the rain, orange and violent against the grey night. I didn't ram him, I just claimed the space that was mine. He had to choose, the ditch or the brakes. He chose the ditch for a second, his truck bouncing over the gravel shoulder before he wrestled it back onto the pavement, falling in line behind me. "Are you okay?" I glanced at Sarah. She was staring at me, her face ghostly in the dashboard lights. "You're not a normal trucker," she whispered, her voice trembling. "Who are you?" "I'm a man who wants to finish his delivery and get his dog some dinner," I replied, though the weight in my chest felt a lot heavier than that. We hit the construction zone. The orange barrels flew past like blurred sentinels, glowing in the dark. I moved the truck to the center of the single lane, the Jersey barriers hugging my tires on both sides with only inches to spare. Now they were stuck. They couldn't flank me, couldn't shoot at the cab without hitting the back of the trailer, but they weren't giving up. The SUV behind me began ramming the DOT bumper of the trailer. Thud, thud. Each impact sent a shockwave through the cab, making the steering wheel jerk in my hands. They were trying to break the airlines. If they snapped the glad hands, my trailer brakes would lock up, and I'd be a sitting duck in a metal coffin. "Jack, look! Up ahead!" Sarah pointed through the rain-streaked windshield. My heart sank. Through the deluge, I saw the flickering orange glow of flares burning on the road. A heavy-duty tow truck, a wrecker, was parked sideways across the narrow lane, its amber lights rotating lazily, casting a sickly yellow hue over the scene. 2 men stood beside it, braced against the wind, holding short-barreled shotguns. Miller had used a radio or a cell phone to call ahead. They'd cut us off. They had the bridge blocked, and there was nowhere to turn. I had a split second to make a choice. Behind me, the SUV was still lashing out, a relentless predator. In front, a literal wall of steel and lead. I looked at the gap. To the right of the tow truck's rear, there was a small space between its bumper and the Jersey barrier. A gap meant for a motorcycle, maybe a small car. "Hang on! Get on the floor, now!" I barked. I didn't hit the brakes. I did the opposite. I stood on the accelerator, the engine roaring in a low-frequency growl that I felt in my marrow. I hit the air horn, a deafening, bone-shaking blast that echoed off the concrete barriers like a war cry. I wasn't going to stop. I wasn't going to let them take her. I aimed the nose of the Pete for that gap. The men with the shotguns scrambled, their bravado vanishing the moment they realized 40 tons of steel wasn't slowing down. One of them fired, the buckshot peppering the grill, but then they were diving for cover behind the barriers. The impact was visceral. The passenger side corner of the cab slammed into the tow truck's winch assembly with a roar of crushing metal that drowned out the storm. The entire truck tilted, the left side wheels leaving the ground for a terrifying, weightless heartbeat. Sarah screamed as the world tilted 45 degrees, the cab filling with the smell of ruptured hydraulic fluid and hot iron. The Peterbilt roared, the rear duals screaming as they fought for purchase on the tow truck's metal deck. I steered into the tilt, praying the center of gravity would hold. With a final agonizing groan of steel, we punched through, dragging a section of the tow truck's heavy steel railing with us like a trophy of war. We were through, but the truck was wounded. I could hear the rhythmic hiss of a punctured coolant line and the heavy metallic drag of a bent tie rod. The steering wheel was pulling hard to the right, vibrating so violently it was numbing my arms. The dashboard lit up like a Christmas tree, low oil pressure, coolant temp rising. "We're not going to make the next town," I said, my mind racing through the mental map of these back roads I'd driven for 20 years. "The engine's bleeding out. We have to go off-road. There's an old logging camp about 5 miles up, Blackwood Trail. It's overgrown, tight, and it leads to a dead-end quarry." Sarah looked at me, blood trickling from a small cut on her forehead where she'd bumped the dash. "A dead end? Jack, if we go there, we're trapped." "No," I said, catching Miller's headlights in the mirror as he cleared the wreckage of the tow truck. "In the open, they have the speed and the guns. In the woods, in the dark, they have to deal with me. And they have to deal with Bear." I wrenched the wheel, forcing the limping Peterbilt off the main highway and onto a narrow, gravel-strewn trail that vanished into the black heart of the pines. The branches scraped against the sides of the trailer like fingernails on a chalkboard. "The hunt is over," I whispered, shifting down as the mud began to suck at the tires. "Now the fight starts." Behind us, the SUV and the pickup didn't hesitate. They followed us into the trees, their lights dancing wildly through the thick timber. They thought they had us cornered. They didn't realize I'd been in tighter spots than this, with much worse people waiting for me in the dark. I checked the mirror one last time. Miller was coming. He wanted the girl, and he wanted me dead. He was going to get neither. The logging trail was a narrow tunnel of suffocating green and grey. Every few yards, the Peterbilt's mirrors clipped a pine branch, sending a spray of freezing rainwater through the shattered passenger window. The mud was thick, a deep, clay-heavy sludge that groaned under the weight of the drive tires. I kept my eyes locked on the faint ruts, fighting the steering wheel as it bucked and kicked in my hands like a live animal. Behind us, the lights of the pickup and the remaining SUV were erratic, bouncing and swinging as they struggled with the terrain I was forcing them through. "The quarry is just ahead," I said, my voice low. The dashboard was bleeding red light now. The engine temperature was climbing into the danger zone, and the rhythmic tick-tick-tick of a dying manifold echoed through the floorboards. "Sarah, when I stop, you don't wait. You take the flashlight from the side pocket and you get behind the trailer. You stay in the shadows. Do not move unless I tell you." "What about you?" she asked. She looked at me, and I could see the reflection of the dashboard warnings in her eyes. She wasn't just scared anymore. She was seeing the reality of the situation. We were running out of road. "I'm going to end this," I said. The trail opened up into a wide, jagged bowl of grey stone. The old quarry was a desolate place, filled with rusted-out machinery and piles of gravel that looked like small mountains in the dark. I swung the trailer wide, using the last of the momentum to pivot the truck, so the trailer blocked the entrance to the clearing, creating a makeshift barricade. The engine gave one final shuddering gasp and died, the turbo winding down with a mournful whistle. Silence rushed in, heavy and thick, broken only by the tink-tink of cooling metal and the frantic thumping of Bear's tail against the sleeper wall. "Go," I whispered. Sarah scrambled out the driver's side, disappearing into the dark behind the massive tires of the trailer. I stayed in the seat for a moment, watching the headlights of our pursuers spill into the quarry. They arrived with a roar of engines and the smell of burning rubber. The pickup truck slid to a halt 20 feet away, followed closely by the SUV. Miller stepped out of the pickup. He was holding a short-barreled shotgun, his face contorted in a mask of pure, unadulterated malice. The rain had plastered his hair to his forehead, making him look like something that had crawled out of a swamp. 2 men from the SUV joined him, carrying crowbars and a handgun. "Come out, Mercer!" Miller yelled, his voice echoing off the stone walls. "We know she's in there. You made a long trip for nothing but a shallow grave." I reached back and unlatched Bear's harness. I didn't say a word. I didn't need to. Bear's ears were pinned, his teeth bared in a silent snarl that showed every inch of his white fangs. He knew the scent of these men now. He knew they were the threat. I stepped out of the cab, keeping my hands empty and visible. The cold rain hit me, and I felt the familiar shift in my head, the narrowing of the world, until only the targets remained. "The girl isn't part of your business anymore, Miller," I said. I walked toward them, moving slowly, deliberately. I wasn't running. I wasn't hiding. I was closing the distance. "You think because you've got some old army ink that you're a hero?" Miller sneered, raising the shotgun. "You're just a delivery boy who took a wrong turn. Give us the girl, and maybe I'll only take your hands." I stopped 10 feet from him. The other 2 men were moving to my flanks, trying to circle around. This was the moment, the point where the talking stops and the steel begins. "I'm not a hero," I said, my voice barely audible over the rain. "I'm just the guy who's going to stop you." Miller pulled the trigger. The blast of the shotgun was a deafening roar in the enclosed space of the quarry, but I had already moved. I dropped low, rolling behind a rusted-out conveyor belt just as the buckshot shredded the air where I'd been standing. "Bear! Work!" I barked. It was a blur of black and tan. Bear didn't bark. He launched. He took the man on the right, the one with the handgun, by surprise, hitting him with the full force of an 80-pound missile. The man went down hard, his gun firing harmlessly into the dirt as Bear's jaws locked onto his forearm. The scream that followed was visceral, a raw sound of terror that cut through the storm. Miller was trying to pump the shotgun for a second shot, but I was already on him. I didn't use a weapon. I used the weight of 1,000 miles and 20 years of holding back. I rose from the shadows, like a ghost, my fist connecting with his jaw in a short, brutal arc. I felt the bone give way. Miller stumbled back, the shotgun slipping from his hands. I didn't give him time to recover. I stepped into his space, my knee finding his ribs with a sickening crack. He collapsed into the mud, gasping for air that his lungs couldn't hold. The third man, the one with the crowbar, swung wildly at my head. I caught the iron bar mid-air, the vibration stinging my palms. I twisted the bar with a sudden violent wrench, hearing his wrist snap before I drove the butt of the iron into his solar plexus. He doubled over, and I finished it with a sharp elbow to the base of his skull. He went down and stayed down. I turned back to Miller. He was crawling toward the shotgun, his face a mess of blood and mud. I stepped on his hand, not hard enough to crush it, just enough to keep him there. "Where's the notes, Miller?" I asked. "Go to hell!" he spat, blood spraying from his broken mouth. From the darkness behind the trailer, Sarah stepped out. She was holding a small, weathered leather notebook, her brother's notes. She had been holding on to it the whole time. "I have them, Jack," she said, her voice finally steady. "Everything, the names, the dates, the locations of the stash, it's all here." Miller looked at the book, then at me. For the first time, the malice in his eyes was replaced by something else. Realization. He realized that he hadn't been hunting a trucker. He'd been hunting the wrong man entirely. I looked up as the sound of more engines approached, but these weren't Miller's men. Through the trees at the entrance of the quarry, a line of headlights appeared, heavy, high-set lights. One by one, 4 more rigs pulled into the clearing, their air brakes hissing in unison. The Brotherhood had arrived. My call on the CB before we hit the trail had been heard. 5 big men stepped out of the trucks, their silhouettes looming large in the rain. They didn't need to say anything. They stood in a semicircle, a wall of denim and steel surrounding the remnants of Miller's crew. "It's over, Miller," I said, looking down at him. "The highway doesn't belong to you." The rain began to taper off into a cold, biting mist that clung to the jagged walls of the quarry. The heavy thrum of 5 idling diesel engines created a wall of sound that seemed to vibrate the very earth beneath our feet. Miller was still on the ground, his face pressed into the grit, the fight completely drained out of him. His 2 associates were in no better shape. One was clutching a shattered wrist, and the other was barely conscious, groaning as the reality of his situation set in. "You all right, Jack?" The voice came from Big Sal, a man I'd shared many a midnight haul with. He stepped into the light of my dying Peterbilt, his reflective vest glowing like a neon sign. He didn't look at the mess on the ground. He looked at the girl standing by my trailer, and then at the steam pouring from my mangled grill. "I've been better, Sal," I said, finally letting my shoulders drop an inch. "Truck's seen better days too, but we're standing." Bear walked back to my side, his gait slow and deliberate. He gave one final sharp bark toward Miller, a reminder of who really owned the night, before sitting down heavily against my leg. I could feel his heat through my jeans, the only warmth in that frozen hole of a quarry. Sarah walked over to us, her hands still trembling as she clutched her brother's notebook. She looked at the circle of massive trucks and the men standing guard. For the first time since she'd burst out of that diner, the sheer terror in her eyes began to subside, replaced by a weary, profound sense of relief. "What happens now?" she asked, her voice small against the rumble of the engines. "Now the right people get that book," I said, "and the wrong people go exactly where they belong." I reached into the cab and pulled out my sat phone. In this county, the local law might have been in Miller's pocket, but the state troopers and the feds were a different story. I made the call, giving them the coordinates and a brief summary of the accident that had occurred at the Blackwood Trail logging camp. I told them to bring extra zip ties. While we waited, the other drivers didn't just stand around. They moved with a quiet, practiced efficiency. 2 of them stayed on watch at the entrance, their trucks positioned to block any more of Miller's associates who might be foolish enough to show up. Another driver, Lefty Pete, brought out a heavy-duty first aid kit and began tending to the cut on Sarah's forehead. I walked over to the front of my Pete. The grill was caved in, the radiator was weeping fluid like a punctured lung, and the passenger side was a twisted wreck of sheet metal and fiberglass. She'd taken the hit for us, standing her ground when the world tried to shove her off the road. It hurt to see her like that, but I knew she'd roar again. Steel can be bent, and engines can be rebuilt. It's the things inside us that are harder to fix. Miller tried to speak, a wet, gurgling sound coming from his throat. You think this changes anything? We run this town." I didn't even look at him. I just kept my eyes on the horizon, where the first faint blue flickers of state trooper lights were beginning to dance against the clouds. "You don't run the highway, Miller," I said quietly. "You're just a speed bump, and we just drove right over you." By the time the troopers arrived, the sun was beginning to threaten the edge of the sky, turning the mist into a dull, leaden grey. They took the notebook. They took Miller and his crew. They even took statements from the other drivers, though most of the boys didn't have much to say, other than they'd seen a truck in distress and stopped to help. That's the code. You see a light flickering in the dark, you move toward it. The lead trooper, a man with grey hair and a tired face that suggested he'd seen too much of Miller's handiwork over the years, walked over to me as they were loading the wreck of the Suburban onto a flatbed. "We've been looking for a way into this operation for 18 months, Mercer," he said, tapping the notebook against his palm. "This girl's brother. He was a good man. He just didn't have the backup he needed. Tonight, he got it." He looked at the line of heavy rigs and the men leaning against them, drinking coffee from thermos lids. "You fellas move in a hell of a pack," the trooper added. "We just don't like seeing people forced off the road," I replied. I turned to Sarah. She was wrapped in a heavy wool blanket someone had pulled from their sleeper. She looked older than she had a few hours ago, but stronger too. The weight of the secret she'd been carrying was finally gone. "Where will you go?" I asked. "My aunt is in Nashville," she said. "The troopers said they'd get me there. I think I'm going to finish my brother's degree. He wanted to be a lawyer. I think I'll do that for him." She reached out and rested a hand on my arm, her fingers brushing over the unit crest tattoo that had started this whole mess. She didn't flinch this time. "Thank you, Jack. And thank you, Bear." The big dog let out a soft whine and licked her hand. I watched the recovery team winch my Peterbilt onto the heavy-duty lowboy. It felt wrong seeing her wheels off the pavement, her chrome dull under the morning light. But as I stood there, leaning against the cold metal of Sal's rig, I felt a weight lifting off my own chest that had been there for a long time. Bear sat at my feet, his chin resting on my boot, watching the flashing lights with a calm, steady gaze. We'd survived the night, and so had she. Sarah's brother had died, trying to shine a light into a very dark corner of this world. He'd been alone when the shadows caught up to him. But tonight, those shadows ran into a wall they couldn't climb. They ran into the Brotherhood. They ran into a man who doesn't like to see the road used for anything but getting folks home. The highway is a lonely place if you let it be. It's easy to think you're just a ghost in a machine, moving from one flickering light to the next. But then you see someone like Sarah running for her life, and you remember that the lines on the map aren't just for cargo. They're the veins of this country, and sometimes those veins need a little protection. I won't be hauling anything for a few weeks while the shop works its magic on the Pete. I'll spend some time in a quiet cabin, I know, letting the silence drown out the sound of shattering glass and roaring engines. I'll make sure Bear gets the biggest steak in Tennessee, and I'll think about a girl who finally gets to sleep without looking over her shoulder. Justice on the road isn't always about a courtroom. Sometimes it's just about being the person who doesn't keep driving when the world asks for help. It's about being a shield when the wind starts to howl. My truck took a beating, but my soul feels a little lighter today. And in this life, that's a trade I'll make every single time. Thank you for watching, and if stories like this one about courage, sacrifice, and second chances speak to you, please consider subscribing to our channel. Your support helps us share more incredible true stories that honor the forgotten heroes among us.